I find myself in the slightly strange position of why is an engineer giving a keynote at an HR strategy forum? Because technology, innovation, AI, robotics. I'm going to try and convince you that actually some combination of these issues is the most significant challenge for what we do with human resources and people. And my background is sort of rooted in being a technologist and an academic who's become really interested, and an entrepreneur who's become really interested in the impact of these technologies. You're all probably aware, and maybe I should be taking bets or doing a quick straw poll, there are wildly divergent perspectives on the future of work, foreseeing radically different scenarios. On one hand, we've got sort of the radical techno-optimists of Silicon Valley going, we don't have anything to worry about because prosperity will be so universal by 2029 that the world will be a seamless and wonderful place. On the other hand, we have people like Pedro Domingos and a whole variety of other people saying, actually, it's going to be a nightmare. AI will take our jobs and become our robotic masters within the next decade. I'm going to try and suggest what I think is actually going to happen, but I'm also going to pick up what I think is a critical point, which is what actually happens depends upon a whole set of choices that we make, in which the people in this room have an important role to play. Change is happening no matter what. I find myself using phrases like, it is inexorable, but the outcome is not inevitable. And on the inevitability, there is a great Kiwi phrase which I hope translates well, cry me a river. I'm sorry about this, but there's nothing we can really do about it. But how it happens is still very much within our control. Let me set the stage. It's just 10 years since the advent of modern smartphones. And we have made it incredibly easy for almost everyone to access essentially all of the world's information and to connect in rich ways using video to collaborate and cooperate and communicate with all sorts of people. 2008 is the iPhone 3G, and some of you may remember, did anybody else have one of these HTC, the original Android phone? They were so confused. Let's see a show of hands who remembers this wonderful device. We don't know whether it should have a touchscreen or a trackpad or a keyboard. So we'll give it all of them. But it was important because people talk about technologies being exponential. I actually think the key thing is this made it easy. Can you remember the first time you tried to browse on an iPhone? That's all like, this just works. You just touch things, and it works. And that led to all those videos about 3-year-olds playing with them. We now have the problem, as I'll come on to in a moment, of 4-year-olds ordering Amazon services on your Alexa, which happened to me the other day. But critically, what happened is we've dramatically transformed the power of the network. At any given moment in 2008, just 10 years ago, we only had fewer than 1% of the world's population richly connected to each other at any one moment. And you see these statistics about what the penetration is, but the interesting numbers, I think, are what the proportion of the population is relative to people of working age, because if you look at demographics, you've got to remember that in the developing world, there are a lot of very young people. And there are a lot of very old people who, well, there's fewer and fewer of them who are analogs who are never going to touch digital technology. They're either dying or converting. And the two critical lines here are, this orange line is total population. This is the number of people actually working. So we've already passed the number. There are more smartphones than there are people working. We're going to talk about some of the other impacts about technology in passing. There are actually more smartphones in some parts of the world than there are people who are literate. So we have a technology which has only been around for 10 years and has already passed a technology which has been around for 600 years. 5 years ago, something happened that made me really sit up and pay attention. We were doing some work on the future of retail for Samsung and Verizon, and I saw the fastest. I spent 25 years studying how consumers respond to new technology, and I saw the fastest change that I have ever seen in my career. The number of Americans who were using smartphones to make comparison shopping purchases went from fewer than 90% in less than 2 years, fewer than 9% to more than 90%. The whole market flipped. And the way in which people did things in retail stores went from, oh, look, what a nice television, Tell me about it, Mr. Salesperson. Okay, I'll buy that, to people doing this, coming up, getting down on their hands and knees and peering at the back of it to read the model number, and then pulling out their smartphone to read the Amazon reviews and do the price comparison. And it burnt down a staple of US. Anybody here from the middle of the US? Anybody spent much time in the middle of the US? This was a good thing for you because you used to be discriminated against. Prices in the middle of the US used to be systematically higher because it was a very long way between stores. Once you'd gone to the problem of driving 40 or 50 miles through empty cornfields to a big box store, I'm not going to drive 40 miles in the other direction. And it eliminated the price discrimination that was going on. We empowered consumers to use information to compare quality, price, and availability. And I started being really intrigued after 25 years working with the technology companies on how they create stuff to focusing on the broader economic and social implications. In parallel with that, we were also working intensely on how technology would reshape the world of knowledge work. Is there actually anyone here from Thomson Reuters? But this went back about 5 years to doing some of the earliest work on AI's impact on knowledge work. And that led to my sort of focusing about what is going on with this combination of technologies and what are the broader social and economic implications. Now this list has shifted. When I began, I was more focused on smartphones and broadband, and I had a different view of what the problems were. When I started writing and thinking about this, it was about here, and I thought this was an access problem about whether or not enough people had access to this information. Over the course of trying to write about it over the last 2 years, that problem has gone away, so I've had to change the title of my book. It used to be Everyone Gets a Wand, but it's not a very interesting story if everyone got a wand. What is happening is rapid innovation the coevolution of, and the adoption and diffusion of 5 key technologies are driving a radical and disruptive shift. So the first big takeaway is these 5 really matter, and it's all of them, and it's them in combination. So it's not just AI, it's not just smartphones. It's when you put smartphones, which give you access, together with the cloud, which enables you to glue stuff together, with AI and robotics and the Internet of Things, and you get a much more significant collective impact. I'll highlight a couple of things. Smartphones are transforming customer experiences. Companies like Warby Parker, Sephora, and Bonobos use them in a way that this emerged from some empirical work we were doing to try and figure out what the state of the art was, to shifting this from all this discussion about omnichannel to actually anchoring everything in your smartphone experience, so the physical store just becomes a place where your smartphone works better. And one of the most interesting ones I see is that Warby Parker, US online company, if you walk into one of their physical stores, they can't serve you or interact with you if you don't have the app and you haven't signed up. And they are now at the point where they're seeking FDA approval to become an optician, a fully blown optician, with the only holdback being it turns out that there are a couple of medical conditions that opticians pick up by looking at the retinas of your eyes: diabetes, high blood pressure, and a couple of others, and making sure that they can capture those, because actually they turn out, for those of us with glasses, we actually get diagnosed better and earlier than the general population, because our optician, as you may all recall, comes in and peers at your eyes and says, you know what, you should go see a doctor about that high blood pressure, or whatever. And within 3 weeks of the launch of the iPhone X, they actually had an application out there which would give you a customized AR view of your face with your customized glasses on it. So you could see what it looked like. Cloud services, most of you go, I know what a cloud service is, it's Dropbox, it's where I store stuff. No, that's actually not the important thing. What has happened over the last, and it really is just the last 2 or 3 years that this has happened, is that cloud services, which used to be all about doing engineering, the software engineers have figured out how useful they were and been doing a long time. Over the last 2 or 3 years, there has been a dramatic shift. And there was an inflection point somewhere about 2 or 3 years ago at which the growth went up and suddenly went to about 5 percentage points per month. That's not 5% a year, that's 5% a month is the rate at which in small and medium businesses the adoption and usage of cloud services is accelerating. Businesses built on IoT are reshaping consumer behavior. Another one of my straw polls. Who here lives in the UK and has kids between the ages of 17 and 21? How much are you paying for car insurance? Way too much. So, like, for those of you who don't know, in the UK, that runs hundreds of pounds a month, thousands of pounds a year, because the UK is one of the few places that has the good sense to actually price insurance for young men driving at the real cost of young men driving. And they're basically walking, talking, running, driving suicide machines. So, this is a fascinating story. A company called Track Global figured out that they could use IoT to measure, monitor, and shape consumer behavior. And they spent nearly 2 years trying to sell this to every incumbent insurer in the UK. All of them went, no, nobody wants it. We send out policies and we pay claims or dispute them. We don't have a department that actually interacts with customers, let alone somebody who's going to do AI and figure out how we run experiments on people. Sounds vaguely moral to me. The reality is, fed up with this, they actually decided to launch their own insurance company. They got other people to underwrite it. It's pay as you drive. They make drivers over 40% safer. And that gives them dramatically superior economics. They're saving lives and progressively saving money in the same process. What then happened, fascinatingly, was a couple of years into this business is less than 5 years old, and at this point, even if you don't know, you may be buying services from it, because a couple of years later, and hold this thought, because I'm going to come back to the implications of this, the incumbent started coming to them and said, hey, could we borrow or buy your service and put a white label on it and sell it under our brand? What did Carrot do? They went, yeah, I like that, because actually we're the technology guys, and we'll take your distribution network, and we'll take your relationships, and we'll focus on doing this and reshaping on-demand and the car ownership model. AI has become pervasive. Nearly half the households in the US now take it for granted that on a daily basis you can talk to an AI. And there was this very sharp inflection point between the Black Friday of Thanksgiving, in which the US installed base took off. It's now more than 50 million, and it's rapidly approaching 50% of US households. So that ship has sailed. There is an assumption that we take it for granted. My 4-year-old actually is capable of expressing opinions, which goes something like, we actually had a Jibo robot in the house at one point or another, and my nanny said, well, Jibo's creepy, and my 4-year-old said, and she's stupid as well. Because there's a relative comparison between, and I like Google now, but the music's terrible, right? We have a couple of these sitting on our things. Critically as well, I want to challenge some of your assumptions about what the art of the possible is as well. AI is now no longer just for admin work in the back office. It can now perceive emotion and portray it so convincingly that you will not be able to stop yourself from responding to it as though it was real. Cogito Health, which was originally developed to monitor how veterans with PTSD interacted with call and support lines. Now, why do you really care if a veteran with PTSD is calling up customer service in the hospital system? You really want to be able to tell if they're anxious or angry. And actually, AI is better at doing that than people are in general. Very highly trained, emotionally connected people not like me at all, I can barely read affect, are really, Cogito is better at doing that. And interestingly, it takes a really long while to build that stuff in the health sector, so they have pivoted into 2 businesses. One is doing stuff for health, and the other is doing stuff for improved customer service. At the other end of the spectrum, in terms of portraying it and closing the loop, there's a New Zealand-based company called Soul Machines, which builds digital humans, digital avatars, whose faces aren't just done by doing film. They actually drive the whole thing with a neural network so that the emotion is so realistic that it will trigger in you all those cues that you don't really know are there. Interestingly, They've just announced a partnership with the Bank of Scotland. In fact, this morning I see there's an announcement about their partnership with Daimler-Benz. It turns out that, by the way, it seems that for many people under many circumstances, a really well-informed robot, which you know is simulating emotion, is actually better than dealing with a person who's reading from a script and trying to sound sincere. Hi, I'm Helen from customer service, and I'm delighted to be able to help you today. What is your problem? Yeah, actually it turns out that the lack of integrity that's involved in that actually pisses people off, and they'd actually deal with a robot. Okay, I know you're a robot, but at least you're not trying it on. And I want, however, to highlight that despite the massive amount of hype that you see, AI, and in particular machine learning, without getting technical, the primary form in which it is being deployed and developed today, still has some really profound limitations. Now, it's getting really, really, really good, really fast at doing routine, narrow stuff. But you can still fool it, and it has profound limitations. You probably all think that's a turtle. Google's image recognition algorithm thinks it's a gun. So you can probably just read it, but it says rifle, shield, maybe a revolver. That's because they work, the particular way they work with statistics, if you put the right statistical cues in the image, you can completely fool them. And the same applies to all sorts of other data. So really profound limitations. So what is AI actually really good at? It's really, really good at narrow and routine tasks. It's really good at statistics where you've got history and there's not a change, but it can't actually build a causal model. This is, if I'm feeling provocative sometimes in discussions amongst my AI peers, I mean, bizarrely, I find my career sort of going full arc, because the first decade of my career or so was in AI and robotics. I'll tease them and go, yeah, all you're doing is sophisticated non-parametric statistics with large data sets. Yeah, whatever. Okay, you do it a funky, cool way, but it's basically statistics. We don't yet have a modern machine that can match the ingenuity of a 3-year-old. So when you think about who here's got toddlers other than me, you think about the crazy shit your 2-year-old does? Robots are significantly dumber than that. They are completely incapable of generalizable learning or of dealing with an out-of-context question because they don't actually have an abstract representation of the world. Robots are also changing dramatically in unexpected ways. This is not about robots in factories. This is about robots that are autonomous and collaborative, working alongside and amongst us. They're now becoming economically viable for even basic physical work. My favorite is these little scurrying things, which if any of you have ever been in a market garden or a nursery, are made by Harvest Automation, and they automate this literally backbreaking job of bending down and picking up a plant and moving it a little bit further apart as they grow. There is a lot of intense, routine physical work which used to be paid less than minimum wage because it was done by people who were illegal immigrants and had no other options. It can now be automated economically. And tools such as Baxter, which sit next to you, and rather than having to formally program them, you train them by showing them what it is you want to do and then just ask them to repeat the task. These technologies are, and forgive me, I'm going to use a couple of important technical terms from sort of the technology. They are a platform, and I'm going to use the word platform in 2 senses. That is what the economists would call a general purpose technology. As a platform, they do 2 things. You can think of them as sort of, those 5 technologies together are really a set of Lego bricks which you can put all sorts of things together with. That's one meaning of the word platform. And the other meaning of the way which platform gets used over and over is connecting people, or connecting people and computers, or connecting people and AIs. In both senses of the word, these things are a general purpose technology. And as I got into this, I stopped focusing on the technologies, and I started trying to summarize as crisply and clearly what the broader economic, social, and political impact is. We started with this idea of empowered citizens who are capable now of making well-informed decisions through a wealth of information, both because they have access to lots of information and because they can collaborate and communicate with all sorts of other people at a time. If you're in doubt, ask the question on your iPhone. like call a friend. Call a friend is always available. The second really important one, which we're going to have a big impact on the world of work, is accelerated innovation. The pace at which you can do things under new ways of working is dramatically quicker. And the third is what I've come to call unleashed creativity. And this is where we start to focus in on the world of work. Automating the routine and cherishing the creative. There is still a vital, important, and central role for people to play in this because AI and all this other stuff still has some really profound limitations. Yes, it's going to change the economy and society in some ways, but there's still a vital place for people. How far does this go? This is one of my favorite examples. 5 years ago, I got something badly wrong. I thought the impact on smartphones would be limited to big-ticket items that were easily compared, like televisions or things like that. A very objective, I'm spending several $100s, I'll go to the time and effort. I can draw a direct line from smartphones to liquid packaging for food. Because we had transparency, because it's got easier to make reservations so we go out more, that's accelerated food delivery, it's accelerated grocery delivery. We've also seen for a whole variety of interesting food startups, word-of-mouth discovery becoming easier. That has reduced dependence on stores, shelf space, and packaging. And there is a direct impact that the smartphone is having as far afield as liquid food packaging because it's become less important what it looks like. You're probably all familiar with the manifestation of this in Amazon's no-nonsense packaging. What do I care what it looks like? Because I'm never going to see it on the shelf. It's just going to be shipped to me. And I'm comparing it on the basis of the review. So when I explain to people in the packaging industry that the impact that they're seeing is the fault of the smartphone, I'm initially met with incredulity, and then I walk them through the steps in the logic. It's transforming it way beyond digital, how we shop. For those of you who don't know and are curious about the impact that this has, there's a great William Gibson quote, which is, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet." If you want to know what the future of retail looks like, it looks like the US, where there's a Wikipedia article on it now called Retail Apocalypse. And the number of people walking through malls in the US has just about halved in the last 3 or 4 years. We've had 17 bankruptcies in 2017 of more than $1 billion, largely driven by tightening price pressure, comparison shopping, and some really dramatic macro shifts in people's behaviors. It's having a huge impact on mobility. This is a span of just 2014, oh, I'm sorry, we lost something, 2014 to 2017. Ride-hailing over 3 years went from 8% of business transportation to 60%. Oh, the taxi industry went down by a factor of 4, and car rental, which is peripheral, halved. Inside most companies' planning cycle. It's even transforming businesses traditionally thought of as way beyond the tech sector. What on earth could technology possibly have to do with where I choose to lay my head at night? Well, Airbnb. We talked about insurance. It's having a big impact on how we consume and use healthcare. I changed this slide in the last 48 hours because of a set of news items I saw about. Anybody here a GP at hand user? Anyway, can we see a show of hands? Right, you've used it already. This service has only been out for a few months, and these are 5 surgeries in London. One of them, in its first 17 days, tripled the number of patients it was supporting. So a really big shift in primary care happening right here in London now through GP at hand. It's also driving a really major shift in the world of work. While the tech titans are growing rapidly, we're seeing an explosion of innovation jobs in tech startups, but there's 2 big questions. There's early indications of growth of jobs in tech-enabled businesses, but there's actually a great deal of uncertainty about how established businesses are going to adapt. Let's pick up that question. This new way of working includes very different arrangements for when and where people work. So we talked about this as a platform, a dramatic growth in the use of this GPT to connect people with new works. Many more people either in the gig economy, and it turns out when you drill into the numbers that the overwhelming majority of people who are already in the gig economy are in it because that's what they prefer and they're actually happier working that way. Yes, there are issues at the margin, but in most people's case, it is a conscious and deliberate choice because the flexibility it affords to organize their work around their family, their life, and other commitments is something that most people who are in routine jobs with fixed hours value more highly than almost anything else. And it doesn't have to be done even in economically rapacious places like the US. Hello Alfred and people like that have demonstrated that you can do this while providing good benefits and a supportive social network without having to do it on penurious contracts. It has enabled the emergence of what I've come to call a new born digital way of working that's just more effective than traditional approaches. When I say more effective, there's an interesting shift. The technologies have become sufficiently powerful, effective, and easy to use that they're eroding all the economies of scale. So what are the key elements of it? 4 things. Relentless and ruthless automation of routine tasks. One of my grad students at MIT did a bunch of work on how the tech titans have stayed fast while growing big. You know what the answer is? Automate everything. Get up in the morning. If you did it 3 times, figure out a way to script it, to automate it, to get a robot to do it. That's what you do. Don't worry about the job losses. Don't worry about the business case. There will be enough opportunity if you just keep doing that. Secondly, people looking much more for purpose, creativity, collaboration, and agility in their work. I'll come back to the agility, the ability to actually get stuff done rather than fighting an uphill battle against bureaucracy becomes a really important determinant of where people will choose to go work. Thirdly, flexible working arrangements in all sorts of different ways. And lastly, by anybody who's in the Vegas bit of enlightenment, support for all employees to pursue lifelong learning, a theme that Linda's going to pick up at the end of the day. So what does this do? Well, it improves productivity, improves job satisfaction, accelerates innovation. Traditional workplaces are just, candidly nowadays, less innovative and productive. This will be compounded as they lose the war for talent. Because if you've got an environment which looks like the one on the left, you get to recruit, retain, and keep the good people. And that will create a very strong positive feedback loop. The good people will go to the places that suit their working desires. Born digital, insurgent businesses thrive in this environment. And critically, they can overcome incumbents' economies of scale and scope. If you're a large incumbent, in many cases, all of that money you spent on building infrastructure and defining processes and optimizing and quality is actually an encumbrance now rather than an advantage. Because if I've got direct access to consumers, I've got cloud access for modular services that cover all my business processes, I've got AI to automate everything, and I've got a bunch of rapid prototyping and product development products for quick to match, I can start easy, fast, and cheap, I can evolve quickly, and I can scale up very rapidly. So I have another key takeaway. If you want to tell the real story of Uber, it's not Uber as a giant car-sharing behemoth. It's Uber as a company which evolved through 4 major shifts in less than 8 years. That's a very, very different way of doing businesses. For those who don't know the origin story of Uber, it was originally an on-demand hailing service for really rich people in downtown San Francisco because the taxis sucked so badly. And it guaranteed you in the early days that you would either get a Mercedes E-Class or a Mercedes S-Class. That was the proposition of Uber Cab as it was originally launched. It changed its name, launched in October 2010. Just 2 years later, UberX, which brings a whole bunch of people in, drives down the price dramatically and creates a whole bunch of gig economy employment. It uses the platform to match people even better. 2 years later, Uber Pool drives down the price even further by putting people in pools together. And it's gone on to build Uber Eats and a whole variety of other services. My most interesting announcement for those who here lives in London. Anybody London dwellers? Any London dwellers here use Citymapper? Citymapper is turning into a bus company. They originally had one bus service, but they were forced to run it under the old TfL rules, which still had to be like any other bus, except it was painted green rather than red. Now they basically got an Uber-like license for buses. So these are on-demand buses to fill the holes in London's transport network. My daughter, who now lives in Whitechapel, is so happy about this. Because one of the big problems in the transport network, apparently, is after midnight in East London trying to go north-south rather than in-out. You can get back into the middle of the city, right? But you want to go from sort of somewhere south of the river to somewhere north of the river, but you're not right in the middle of the city. It's really bloody impossible. It's a big hole in the TfL network. That's where Citymapper's first on-demand bus routes are going to be. For established, born analog businesses, however, becoming digital is a difficult and hazardous journey. I found it helpful, and this is more of an empirical observation than anything, to think about it in sort of 4 levels: digitally efficient, digitally enabled, where you're starting to evolve your business models, anticipating tech-led behavior changes and creating new value. This is where born digital businesses start. So let's look at each of these 4 levels. Way too many, this is changing, but if I go back less than a year, way too many established businesses are stuck at level 1. And all you're doing with digital, in that case, is driving cost economies, trying to save money, focus on cost reduction and value creation. That is not a basis for competing effectively. The first significant step is a move to more effective ways of doing business, changing the way in which you interact with your customers so it's actually a conversation, supporting agile working, changing the social contract with your employees to support flexible working arrangements, and building a business in which you are dramatically accelerating startups. At level 3, the focus shifts from exploitation, which is I built up a business and I'm still selling the same products to the same customers, albeit in a better way and evolving them more quickly, to actually going and looking for new opportunities to create new value. What is happening with behavior change? Can I understand pain points in behavior? Can I predict innovation trajectories? And actually going out and building new businesses. Born digital businesses start here, and this is a huge untapped opportunity for incumbents. The most powerful and influential form, which very few born analog established enterprises got to, is becoming a digital ecosystem. And this is our best estimate from a sort of informal sampling process of what the distribution looks like. We've got fewer than 5% of incumbent businesses that have actually got to there. Perhaps 15% here. Tragically, 15 or 20% of businesses, when you ask them, yeah, technology, no, I don't think it's an issue in my business, right? But this is the great middle ground. It's like, yeah, maybe we're using it to drive cost out, or we're starting to change we interact with customers, when actually way too few businesses are here yet. The challenge is that for most senior managers, this is what another one of my favorite science fiction authors, Ian M. Banks, who's also the novelist Ian Banks, called an outside context problem. An outside context problem is what happened to my Maori ancestors when my English ancestors turned up, which is, what is that absolutely enormous thing with all that white stuff? Because it didn't look anything like a waka, which is a outrigger canoe. It was a British ship, or Trobriand Islanders confronted with an aeroplane. Just at the point at which we got to think that we knew everything, and we as senior managers, they changed the frickin' rules in less than a decade. Now, there are examples, really powerful examples, of particular industries going through this change, perhaps even more rapidly. Tammy was reminding me of the example of the impact of Morris, what happened when Morris introduced the production line. But this is happening at greater or lesser speed throughout the economy to everybody. And if it hasn't happened to you yet, it will to some extent soon. And that's a really enormous challenge, because you're asking people at a late stage in their career to suddenly go, wow, there's all this new stuff I have to learn now? What? None of this existed when I started working. My straw poll. Who here had the internet, a cell phone, and a PC in high school or as they started college? Don't be embarrassed. Don't be embarrassed. Can we have these people stand up? Right? All of them, right?
You were rich and young.
Some combination thereof. These people are digital natives, right? These people are digital natives. You can sit down now. It's okay. We know who you are now. Here's my point. For everybody else in this room, we are the only generation in history who are digital immigrants. Everybody who came before us was an analog. Everybody who comes after us is a digital native. We had to suffer through this shift, and just when we ended up in charge, they changed the bloody rules. So you've got to understand all of this stuff. You've got to understand the technology. You've got to understand the broader social impact. You've got to think about how you build your business. So let me wrap up with what I think are 3 major challenges from the human resources and people point of view. Now, we can elaborate them in more depth, but I'm going to highlight just 3. The first is building a new set of what I have come to call digital leadership behaviors, starting with top management, necessarily. Ironically, we find ourselves in a position in top-down, bureaucratic, centrally controlled cultures. You have to issue instructions from the top to tell people that you are delegating authority. We're doing some work in Saudi, which is just absolutely fascinating from that point of view. I highlight 4 particular behaviors here, which I think are really important. One is what we come to call humility, what Deborah Ann Kona at MIT, in her writing on leadership, which oddly enough was so deeply grounded in the tech sector, would call being recognizing it's okay to be an incomplete leader if you're looking for the leadership model, because you're going to have to deal with a bunch of know-it-all digital natives and specialists. And that actually means you've got to figure out some new ways of behavior because you don't have all the answers. There's what Michael Tushman at Harvard calls ambidexterity, and that is the ability to work both in the exploit mode, evolve the core, and simultaneously in the explore mode, have different parts of the business work by different rules, be allowed to innovate more quickly. They don't have to write a business case and a plan for everything. I won't name names, but I overheard a fascinating conversation the other day about a situation for a global company in which the CEO and the head of the country and the global head of marketing all agreed that they wanted to make a change. But somewhere in there, despite all 3 of them having agreed explicitly and issued the instructions, it didn't happen because the 3 of them couldn't overcome the bureaucracy. There was an approval process. The budget wasn't there. I didn't have an authorization. The brutal controls that enable you to optimize and do that. By the way, I don't usually say this, but I have a sort of rule which is for a company which isn't changing, first you fire the CEO, and then you fire the CIO, and then you fire the CFO, and maybe then we need a new head of human resources. No, I didn't say that, really. And I'm going to bring out 2 other things that emerged as we started putting these behaviors together. A really intense focus on getting outside the organization. This is a very unfamiliar English word, but it is acuity in the sense of sharpness of vision and the ability to discern what matters, the ability to look outside and beyond the organization, and agility to get stuff done. So the second major challenge is then identifying the key specialist skills your business needs, and then recruiting or retraining people with them, and then retaining those scarce people. Mobile UX, cloud, AI and ML, IoT, robotics, and agile ways of working, and that's going to mean giving them meaningful and fulfilling work. It's going to mean agility in the workplace, both in structure and careers, and it's going to mean flexibility to suit employee and organizational needs. The third major challenge is then a really significant underlying shift to supporting and developing accelerated lifelong learning. It actually means that when I go back here and I talk about this accelerate learning, what's his name? Guy who founded Fast Company has a book out where he says the key thing of a leader is being a lifelong learner. No, it isn't. The key thing of a leader is actually being supportive of all the people on your team learning and learning more quickly than they otherwise would and continuing to learn more quickly. It's an outer-directed rather than inner-directed behavior. So, if we don't respond effectively, the future's bleak. The economy will be inhibited by the dominance of the tech titans. These businesses will be small, hobbled by regulation. Defensive strategy of the incumbents will stymie this innovation, perceiving the threat that may emerge. And established enterprises, if they respond slowly and effectively, many will ultimately, nevertheless, be swept away. There will be not much new work, and there will be massive loss of existing work. That's a dire frickin' future. On the other hand, if we actually start adapting effectively, tech titans either behave better because they recognize that it's in their own bloody interests, or they get reined in. They create much new work. We see a surge in employment inside the technology sector amongst startups and small businesses. And we also see an explosion of innovation and entrepreneurship because of the way cloud services and things like that are enabling to do. And perhaps most importantly, because this mitigates job destruction and actually has the potential to create significant new work, on the top right-hand side, big established enterprises respond to these challenges effectively, they seize the opportunities, they actually create new value, and they enable much new, different, and better work. So it's up to us. If we don't recognize and respond to the challenge, if we perpetuate these old ways of doing businesses, we will be swept away in a perfect storm of creative destruction. On the other hand, if we recognize and respond to the challenge, we seize the opportunities, we create new value, we can create lots of new, different, and actually much better work. Thank you.